In the first video of the Data API series, we talked about data in Blender, the internal structure of Blender, and how it uses these data blocks to save your data within a Blender file. But today we're going to talk about external data and how it relates to these data blocks. So you might know there's a couple different types of external data you can have loaded into your blend file. These being images, videos, fonts, text files, and simulation cache. We're going to talk mainly about images in this video just because that is the most common thing you're probably going to run into as external data. You notice that I am in an unsaved Blender file right now. This is just a new, fresh launch of Blender. We haven't saved anything yet, and I'm going to jump right over into the image editor and load an image from my desktop. We know from the last video, if I want to maintain this reference, make it persistent, even though it's not linked to anything in my scene, it is linked to this current image editor window as a soft reference, but to be safe, we can set this to use a fake user, and we know this image will always load when we load this Blender file. The key word here being when we load this Blender file, or when I load this Blender file, I will have this image. If I save and share this Blender file, this image might not be loaded. In fact, it most likely won't be loaded unless someone had the same image saved with the same name in the same location on their PC. Let's just switch into the scripting tab and grab a reference to this image as it exists in the Data API. I know this image was named sprite.png, and because it was named sprite.png, that becomes the name of the data block itself. It's a little misleading here because I'm getting bpy.data.images sprite.png, and you might think that this is the image itself, but this is really a reference to the image data block, which is holding this image. Or more legitimately, it's just holding a reference to this image. So let's store that reference as a variable. A property of this image then will be its file path, which is where it's loading the file from. So I can say image.filepath, path equals image.filepath. And then let's print the path. Run this, open the system console, and you'll see this gives me the full absolute path to my desktop. Since I was in an unsaved Blender file when I loaded this image, it's the absolute path. However, if I was in a saved Blender file that existed on my computer, this file path would be a relative path. Blender likes to use relative paths when it can use relative paths, but since it had no reference of where this Blender file existed, it just defaults to referencing that image's absolute path. So if I go ahead and I save this Blender file, and I run this script again, open up my console, you'll see that it changed it to a relative path. This is kind of an interesting hidden behavior of Blender, and I think this just comes from starting with a untitled, unsaved Blender file and then saving it. So this file path is now technically a relative file path to this Blender file. You can tell this is relative now because it's basically navigating from this Blender file to where that image exists. And you could see how this could be useful if I wasn't working in my desktop and instead had like an images subfolder next to my Blender file containing that image. In that case, I could zip that whole containing folder and send it over to whoever I want. They could open the Blender file and it would still load that image. If you want to be sure that all of your paths are relative, Blender has a built-in tool. If you go to File, External Data, you can see there's an option here for Make Paths Relative. When I run that, it's just ensuring that any data block that has a .filepath property is referencing that file path relatively from the saved Blender file and navigating to that file path. If I instead said, no, I want that to be an absolute path, you can do that too. And that's file external data, make paths absolute. So why would you want an absolute path ever? A scenario where you might want an absolute path versus a relative file path could be you are changing the location of the Blender file itself. Say I wanted to save this Blender file as something else. Blender's pretty smart about this. If I said file save as and saved it somewhere else, even if my paths were all relative, it would update those relative links and make sure that all of those relative links still reference the correct files. But if I navigated through my Windows File Explorer and I made a copy of my Blender file and I moved it to a different location, opened up that Blender file with relative paths, all those relative paths would be broken because they would be trying to get the relative path the same way as it was from that original file path to that external data. Now, a Blender file essentially works like a zip file, and you can pack your images or any external data into your Blender file itself. And the way you do that is really simple. You can go to File, External Data, Pack Resources. It doesn't give you any options here. It just packs the resources into the Blender file. And you can see in my info that I packed one file, that file being the image. Now if I run the script asking for the image's file path, what happens? We can open up our system console and you'll see that file path didn't change. It's still my absolute path. So why is this? It's packed into the Blender file. Why would it still say that the path is my path to that image? Well, Blender always stores file path. What it really did when I packed this file into the Blender file was change a property in the data block that wasn't file path. It was called packed file, or we could get this by image.packedFile. This would now be true for this image. If an image is a packed file, this overwrites the fact that that image is loaded from a file path. It just loads from the blend file itself. So whenever an image or any external data is packed, Blender will first find that packed data and load the image from the packed data. But it still keeps this file path property. If you noticed when I went to File External Data to pack the resource, there's also an option to unpack resources. The first option here will unpack the image next to this Blender file in a folder called Images, and it'll create that file if it doesn't exist already. This second option does the same thing as the first option. However, it will always overwrite that image if it already exists in that location. This third option will use the file in the original location and create when necessary. So I loaded that image from my desktop. Say I packed that resource and then I deleted that image from my desktop. If I use this option, then that image would again be created in that desktop location. And that's where file path comes into play again, because it needs a reference to that original file path to be able to create that file in the original location. The fourth option here will write back to the original location and overwrite that image in the original location. So using the packed data, always overwrite that image that already exists if one exists. The fifth option is just to disable autopack if you turned on autopacking. And the sixth option here will keep the reference path, remove the packed version, and doesn't write anything. If the external file is missing, this will break the link to that file. So if I received a Blender file, I know it had packed data, I will save it into a folder named that Blender file's name, and then I will unpack using this option. It'll give me a nice clean directory of images related to that file. So what happened to its file path? Let's run this script. You'll see that now that image file exists in a relative folder called textures with the name of sprite.png. So even though I didn't manually go in and say make files relative, when I unpacked, it unpacked to that relative location, and Blender references this as a relative file path now. So why are we using operators from the UI and not using Python here? Well, we can use Python if you wanted to. This would simply be image.unpack, and then it gives us an option of method. And the method we just used technically is called useLocal. All of those methods that were in that selection menu are available to us. Those would be useLocal, writeLocal, which overwrites always and uses that local path. Use original, which is using the original location and does not overwrite. And then you could probably guess write original would be using the original path and always overwriting. And then finally remove, which is the same as that last option from the selection that we saw before. So if you wanted to do it through Python, this is the unpacking methods that you could use, but you might not always want to use a default unpack method. When I'm working with Blender in a studio pipeline, I generally personally don't like these unpack methods. You notice when I unpacked, it went into a relative folder named textures, and this goes for all of the images that were loaded into bpy.data.images. And you might not want that folder to be called textures, or you might want a subfolder named resources or something like that. And that's where you can just use image.filepath as your source for that image. So if you're familiar with using Python, you could take this image.filepath, maybe get its absolute path, make a copy of that image, copy that image into some location that you can expect in your pipeline, and then manually set image.filepath to your new path, whatever that path might be. Now this could be an absolute path, it could be a relative path. So generally if I did this in a script, I generally follow this up with something like this call, which is just to go through all of the paths and make them relative, which is the same thing that we did when we went into external data and we made all of our paths relative. Okay, I just realized that I left something out while I was editing, and this is super important. So when you're working with external data in Blender, during your session, this external data is loaded into session data associated with the Blender file itself. So say you had an image and then you change that image in Photoshop or edit that image outside of Blender somehow, and you want Blender to accept that change. Well, you can close Blender and you can reopen Blender and it will grab that new image from that new image file path. You can also go to, in your image editor, if you have that image open, you can reload or hit Alt-R and it will reload. But when you're working with a lot of images in your file, you want to do it like this. So for image in bpy.data.images, image.reload. Whenever I'm working with external data, I normally have a script. I have other scripts that have this within it, but it's just a really simple script that you can write when you need to reload all the images. Say you have PBR textures of 5 different models and you don't want to reload images one by one, and you don't want to close and reopen your Blender file every time you want an update to those images. Just keep this in mind that you can call image.reload. And in my last example, where if you were manually setting a new file path for an image, You'd want to run something like this after setting a new file path just to be sure that everything loads from that new file path and you don't have any errors. So I was originally going to now go into linking and appending from another Blender file, but I'm going to split that into another video in this series, so stay tuned for that. Thanks for sticking around for these foundational tutorials. I really want to get into a lot more fun stuff that we can do in Blender that will have cool results for you, but I really wanted to lay down these foundations from my perspective. And if you're following along and learning this, you'll have really solid ground to start doing some really cool stuff and knowing what you're doing while you're doing it.